Hello, it's Joyful Hermit. I want to talk a little bit more about the Fool of Christ, or Fool of God, or Fool of Love, which is maybe what we would call a hermit on steroids. Um, and that terminology developed in the Middle Ages and later. I think that was when that became a term used for hermits or those who had some abrupt, deeper conversion and change in their lives to which they gave themselves exceedingly with a tremendous alteration in their lifestyle to God. Anthony of the Desert, back in the 3rd century or fourth century, wasn't called that, but he had an abrupt change initially, but then he did go and learn more of the hermit life from a hermit type wise elder. So, but he didn't have this same aspect of being a fool of Christ, to where the person can be taken by society as even a little bit daft or gaga, off kilter, or even mentally ill, to have them behave so radically detached from the temporal world. So I want to talk a little bit more about Xenia of St. Petersburg. Some did feel when her husband died, and he was a colonel in the army, in the armed forces in Russia, that when he died and she was 26 years old, that it affected her so greatly that she did have some kind of a breakdown of some sort. That's what people thought initially. And it is a little bit coinky, I think we would think, that she took on her husband's name, was called Andre and then the last name, rather than her own name of Xenia. She did not use her own name from then on. She lived another 45 years, approximately. She also wore her husband's military outfit with the medals and everything. That was her only garment. She gave away her home, all of her possessions, all of her money, and she was a well-off woman, widow. She gave it all to the poor, which was a radical life change, and lived on the streets. A friend called last evening. He's a clinical psychologist. I've known him for years and years. And I was telling him about Fools of Christ and that radical shift when someone gives themselves so radically to God, but to a point where they renounce the world, truly renounce the world. But they don't renounce it for other reasons. They renounce it for love of God. That is their sole desire, is to live for Christ, and out of love for Christ, that they love God so much that they have lost love of the world and all that's in it. So that's the distinction. It's not for other reasons that they want to denounce the world, not because they dislike the world or they dislike people, or that they truly do have a mental issue or a personality disorder or something like that. So anyway, the key is love of God in these people, and their devotion. And that's why giving everything to the poor when they're wealthy, to have such a radical shift, would really take a great deal of love of God and trust in God, but also sort of to be foolish. And in our time period, to just radically do that would take a break, some kind of a mental and emotional ability to break. And it would not be easy to do. If you already started out that way, where you had very little, and had been sort of beaten up by life, it wouldn't be quite as radical a shift. However, to sustain that life in our times, I would say would take great courage, incredible courage to do that. Um, because so much is geared, even, to have to pay our taxes. We need income. We need that to eat and to live, to purchase socks for ourselves or a coat at the Goodwill, even, unless we know people who are going to give to us. So, this Xenia of St. Petersburg, I found out a little bit more about her. She did have people who, after a while, people who knew her and relatives tried to help her, but she would deny their help. She did not want to be taken in to someone's home. But in the cold Russian winters, this friend, a psychologist friend, said, well, what did she do in the cold Russian winters? How did she even survive? Well, she did have people, strangers even, who admired her, or she brought out the compassion in them to help the least of these. And they viewed her as someone who loved Christ so much that Christ was in her. And by doing charity to Xenia was in effect to do something good for Christ. And that's where charity and love of Christ takes us, that we automatically want to help someone in need. So in the cold winters, she did have people who would find it a great honor, and did find it a great honor, and asked her to come in out of the cold, and she would. But it tended not to be relatives. She did not get into that mode of wanting anyone to take care of her or to disrupt her extreme love of God and of renouncing the world. But after, I think I mentioned this in my previous video, that she did try to um, live in the fields at night, where she would pray all night. She would stay awake praying in the fields. And she also helped to build a church at the cemetery, at a graveyard. And a chapel was built there, and at the night, she would try to work on it with bringing stones and helping to construct. So she did that, and it ended up that was where she was buried. And people then developed would go on pilgrimage to this cemetery where she was buried. And there were miraculous healings that occurred at the cemetery when people would go and pray at her graveside. And now in our lives, if someone went to that town in Russia and found that graveyard, they would find a stone engraved dedicated to Xenia. So, and there's also songs dedicated to her, hymns dedicated, that express her life and her love of God. So she's a very interesting person, and people have had miraculous cures by calling out to her and asking for her intercessions, her prayers from the other side. So somebody had put me on Noah, a hermit who lives out in the woods in our time period. He's a man who lives in the woods, and he has lived more the hermit life this way for quite some time on his own, and does what's called stealth camping. So he camps out and then moves around to different locations. He is the one who had found out about Saint Xenia and mentioned to me in a comment. So that's why I've researched Saint Xenia. There's not a lot known about her, but I did find a little bit more of things that occurred after she died. In her life, as the army, her husband's military uniform fell apart after a while over the years. Then she would wear sort of religious sister type, just garments, used garments. She would, when she got cold in the winter, she would use pieces of coats, just ruinous coats, and she would put those around her body to stay warm. Um, and she also, in order to eat, people began to really understand and appreciate that Xenia lived this way for love of God and because she gave up the world, because she wanted God instead of the world. And prayer to her was important. So she would be given food by shop owners. And the shop, because they valued her and they appreciated her way of life and the fact that she loved God so far more than she loved the world. So she got this reputation of being a holy person. So when she died, there were miracles at her grave site. And then there were miracles just with people who would ask her help. So I was thinking of Noah, who likes Xenia and had heard about her. If you have needs, ask Xenia, since he is drawn to this Russian saint. Somehow he heard about her. I don't know how or why he heard about her. But to this day, you can ask these people. They are actually dead people, but they come to help us in our times of need if you ask. If we ask people on the other side, particularly people who are holy on earth and close to God. So I think it would be interesting if any hermit out there, and she is a patron of hermits, a patron of the homeless. She's known as a patron saint of the homeless, which is another reason I'm thinking of Noah, that this is a good person who's actually dead, who would help him in any time of need. For example, if some of the items that he has buried would happen to get water in them and he needed food or clothing in the winter time when he's camping out, it would be call upon Saint Xenia to help you. And if you want to know more about God and develop a closer relationship to God, because that's what Xenia did. That's why she gave up the world, was to draw closer to God. And thus, now that she is actually dead and has been for 200 years approximately, or 100.5 years, she comes back and helps people who have need. So there are many miracles and stories. One time, a widow of a colonel, of an army colonel, had brought her sons to St. Petersburg, trying to get them into the military academy. They didn't make it in. The widow had run out of money, bringing them there to try to get her sons in this academy. And she was weeping and walking the streets of St. Petersburg, and people asked her, "What's wrong? Why are you upset?" And she said, "I'm out of money. I came to try to get my sons in the military academy. Nothing has worked out." And they said, "Ask Saint Xenia. Ask Xenia." They didn't call her saint then. "Ask Xenia," but they considered her a saint. And sure enough, by the next day, everything had worked out for her sons to be accepted in the military academy, and the mother went back to where she lived, and all was resolved. Another situation happened when Xenia was dead, actually dead, which she is now, as opposed to essentially dead. I've been talking about being essentially dead. We're still being alive, but living as if we're dead, as far as our helping others and praying for others and loving others without interpersonally involvement with others in particular who know us or things. So we are more on the other side, observing and praying and loving them. Anyway, there was a poor civil servant who was taking care of his mother and his two sisters. And he had come upon hard times and had come to St. Petersburg to try to work out his financial difficulties. And it wasn't going well at all, and he was standing to lose all and was very upset as to how he was going to pay off debts and also continue to take care of his widowed mother and his two sisters. Someone knew of his troubles then, heard of them as he was there trying to work it out, and said, ask Xenia, or no, I think in this one, Xenia appeared to him in a dream and told him, go to the cemetery to where I'm buried, and which was in this chapel that she herself had helped build when she was alive, and by carrying stones and things, and ask for a requiem mass to be offered for me for the repose of my soul. And he did that, and his monetary and debt problems were immediately resolved in remarkable ways, and he was able to go back to his town and continue taking care of his mother and his sisters and continue with his job as a civil servant. So that was another miracle. And another time, a landowner had need of help and had I think this was a vision of Xenia. And he saw Xenia, or it was a woman landowner, saw Xenia taking water and pouring it around her land, and didn't know what that was all about. Well, that night, her barn came on fire, but it was contained miraculously. The fire did not spread, and it remained just a small fire. The home and all of the land was not burned. And this landowner then offered thanks, thanked God for Xenia. He, or I think it was he or a she landowner, knew that Xenia was foretelling, because Xenia had the gift of being able to see the future, foretelling the future of what was going to happen. It happened, and that experience, or her gift, while she was alive, occurred another time when she met a woman who had been widowed early and was struggling and grieving her first husband, but had no idea that she would remarry. But Xenia told her, your husband right now is burying his wife. Well, it was a man who had lost his wife at an early age. And as it turned out, later, this other young woman met him, married him, and they realized that Xenia had come to her in person. Xenia was alive then, to foretell her that this would be the man who she was going to marry. And at that time, the man had indeed lost his wife and was burying her, having the funeral for her. So, and there were other situations in which, when Xenia was alive, she would foretell the future. She knew in advance when the Empress was going to die, and she would go around telling people to bake brie or whatever, bris or something. It's a word for a certain type of bread or something that was baked when someone died. And so they knew then that someone was going to die, and then it was the Empress. Xenia knew it was going to be the empress. So another time it was some aristocrat's grandson who was going to die, and she foretold that. So she had miraculous gifts because she was indeed very, very close to God. That was the reason why she forsook the world and gave everything away to the poor. So, and she was always trying to help the poor, even though she was poor, after she had taken on this life as a fool of God. So, I think I'm going to talk in another video about my own hermit life. And at times I'd wanted to do that, but why I didn't. Um, Partly situation and partly lack of courage. So it takes a lot it would take maybe, like in her life, a tremendous loss of someone she loved dearly to totally forsake all for God and live in that way of total abject poverty and as a homeless person for the love of God. Anyway, God bless His real presence in us. And I've called out to people who have died, people I've known in life, even a neighbor man who was a mechanic. When my son called me and we were talking, and he was trying to get into one of these zip cars he had rented. He had an important appointment with his job in Washington, D.C., and he couldn't get it to work. And all of a sudden, the conversation changed, and he was, oh my, I need help. How am I going to get to my place on time? And this zip card isn't working to open this car that he had prepaid to rent. They had them situated on the streets. I don't know if they still have zip cars available in cities or not, or if that was just a new business fad for a while. But I said, I'm going to ask Dean Wakefield to help you. And he says, oh no, Mom, who's Dean Wakefield? What are you doing now? I said, well, I grew up next to him. And he was a mechanic. Oh, this was it. He'd gotten into the zip car. He couldn't get it to start. It wasn't starting. That was it. And so I said, Dean will help you. I'm going to ask him. And right then I just said, Dean Wakefield, and I gave my name. I said, grew up next to you. You know who I am. My son needs your help. Get this car started for him. Right then, my son said, it started. He was sort of freaked out, but not too much. He's used to me. But back then, he would accept those favors from God and from people on the other side. In the meantime, over the years, he got involved with someone who is a sociopath and not honest and very much against God and very much against Catholicism also. Catholics tend to have this added dimension of asking for help from those on the other side. I do it from people, I don't care if they're in quote unquote purgatory or in the fullness of light. I ask because people who aren't in the fullness of life are striving on the other side to become in the fullness of Christ's light. They're very eager to help. And that's essentially what I'm doing, being essentially dead. I'm very eager to help people, to love them and to pray for them without a lot of human interaction, because I'm what would be called a consternation, a sign of consternation to many people. They like my son, he would not at all be open to anything I might say or do, prayerfully or otherwise, to get help for him. So other than well, nothing now because he's cut me off. But anyway, don't be afraid to ask for help. The veil is thin from our world and the other world and heaven. So, in faith, ask and believe, and you will receive. God bless His real presence in us.